Well, good morning, everyone, and welcome back to AJ117, Introduction to Terrorism and Homeland Security. My name is Tony Farrar, and of course, I am your instructor for this semester. So this week's chapter is going to cover Chapter 6, where we're going to look at the critical processes of different terrorist organizations. So we have a lot of content to cover, so let's go ahead and just jump right into our weekly lecture. So, terrorist groups and movements represent very complex organizations. And just like other organizations in society, they have a basic rationale and motivation for their existence, specific goals and objectives, divisions of labor and function, and a hierarchy of authority and responsibility. And we learned a little bit about hierarchy in Chapter 5. So this chapter is going to kind of address the wide range of processes and behaviors observed in different terrorist groups and organizations aimed at basically successfully achieving political legitimacy. We'll talk about recruitment, training and maintenance of new members, command and control for operational effectiveness, publicity, news, and social media attention. We'll look at financial independence and the development of different types of leadership, more specifically, new leadership. One point just to kind of drive home before we move on, these are hard. These kinds of, when you try to describe the different processes, because they're always changing. They typically don't remain stagnant. And here is just a little example of a kind of a portion of the hierarchy of ISIS. And it is quite a bit more broad than what you're seeing here. But again, if you go back to Chapter 5 and we talked about leadership and hierarchy, here's an example of that. And part of, that hierarchy gets weaved into the process of these different types of organizations, etc. So Asal and Rethenmeier studied 365 terrorist organizations over an 8-year period. And during that time, 68 or 17% of them killed 10 or more people, and 28 or 7.1% of them killed over 100 or more in different operations. So again, we can really see that there's a wide variance in how each of these groups operate. Now, another author, Gaynor, explains that their actions, or explains their actions, by dividing them into groups based on either their motivation, meaning their intention, or their capabilities to achieve specific objectives. So, for example, actually destroying a target. So, what that means is the lethalness of a terrorist group may be based on the group's motivations and their capabilities to achieve their specific objective. But again, remember, terrorist groups' motivations and capabilities, they're not stagnant, and they are, in fact, dynamic. So if you were to look in your textbook, and I believe it's on page 153 in table 6-1, you'll see some profiles. So basically this table profiles 6 terrorist behavioral groups on the basis of their motivations and their capabilities. And these 6 groups are not a progression, if you will, through which terrorist movements inevitably progress, because they may get stuck at any stage, advance, regress, or dissolve, or their motivations and capabilities may change. Describing a terrorist organization, again, is much like a photograph. It portrays what exists in a particular point in time, but a second photograph, even one taken soon after the first, might show some subtle differences, or maybe some substantial differences as compared to the first photograph. So again, we can go back to the statement that terrorist groups' motivations and capabilities, they're not stagnant. They're always moving, and they are dynamic. I threw in this video just to try to get you. I put it in a couple of other lectures because I really want you to watch it. But part of the critical process when we look at organizations would be, in fact, the recruits, the individuals that come there to become involved in this type of activity. So I threw in the same video that you've seen a couple of times, or at least it's accessible a few times, Inside the Mind of a Suicide Bomber. It's a great video, and I would suggest that you watch it. Okay, so beyond motivation and capabilities, there are many other ways to look at terrorist organizations. Examples include their driving ideology, the quality of leadership, demands made, stage of development, size, degree of specialization, sponsorship, and the extent of public support. So again, this is beyond the motivation and capabilities. Terrorist groups we can look at them, we can examine them based on these different things that we just kind of covered. Now, other factors can also be looked at. So, the selection of targets, whether they hit a soft target or a hard target. An example would be Hezbollah's bombing of a bus in Bulgaria filled with Israeli tourists, popular with Westerners, versus attacking a closely guarded military facility. So, and along with that, the ability to conduct a rapid series of attacks or complex multi-pronged attacks, the degree of independence or basically subordination to another body, the ability to control a territory as a safe haven, the number of casualties caused in individual attacks, and cumulatively, the organization's longevity. So, we have these other things. And I mentioned soft and hard targets. So to give you an idea of what those are, a soft target is a military term to describe kind of a non-defended or an innocent target where they really may not have that much law enforcement presence or security, etc. And a hard target would represent an armed, an area with armed soldiers or operators or well-defended locations, etc. So hopefully those two make sense. So some examples that we could look at. A softer target might be a bus, like when I gave the example of Hezbollah's bombing of a bus in Bulgaria that had the Israeli tourists. There's really not much security, if you will, on this bus. So this is more of a softer target compared to maybe Fort Knox, which is where, currency or gold, etc., might be stored. And you're going to have a harder time at, attacking, if you will, one of these types of targets. Another, soft target could be maybe the beach. And this is a beach in Israel. So again, the difference kind of between hard and soft targets. Disneyland. So again, just kind of running that through your mind, what would you consider to be a hard target and what would you consider to be a soft target? Okay, so as I mentioned just a couple of minutes ago, terrorist groups can also be examined by their ability to conduct rapid series of attacks, the degree of independence or subordination to another group, meaning they're being steered by that other group, the ability to control a territory, or the organization's longevity. So these are other factors to which a terrorist organization can be examined. So now we're going to talk a little bit about, terrorist organizations as learning organizations. So to achieve longevity, terrorist movements must become, learning organizations. And maybe you've heard that phrase in business as well. So these are characterized by basically prizing the acquisition of new knowledge, being nimble when faced with new situations, and thinking a little bit outside the box. So this is, again, this learning organization. There are actually business books to help your companies to become learning organizations. So kind of an interesting thing, right? Now, becoming a learning organization is a survival mechanism, though, for a terrorist organization. For terrorists and other organizations, being a learning organization is a survival mechanism. In a couple of examples, Al-Qaeda responded to drone attacks by decentralizing or breaking up their training groups into smaller groups, so they would be less apt to lose more fighters, if you will, because they weren't all in one place, right? So that kind of makes sense. The USS Cole, attack was successful because Al-Qaeda learned from a previous unsuccessful attack. And if you don't know, there were 2 attacks. So give you a little bit of background on this. Members of Al-Qaeda attempted an attack on the Sullivan while in port at Aden, Yemen on January 3rd, 2000 as part of the 2000 Millennium Attack Plots. Now, the plan here was to load a boat full of explosives and detonate this boat near the Sullivan. But the boat was so overladen, or it was basically too full, that it sank. And that forced the attack then to be, abandoned because they couldn't carry out their mission, right? Well, later, Al-Qaeda tried the same type of attack a second time, this time successfully bombing the USS Cole on October 12th, 2000, because they learned from their first mistake. And that's part of a learning organization. So just as we look at it, as it's tied to terrorism, this learning organization, we can apply this to business situations where you're going to make some bad investments or you make some different mistakes, and you're going to learn from those, and therefore you're going to change your operational system. And hopefully that kind of makes sense. Okay, so let's go ahead and move on. And here's a photo of exactly how this was carried out. A little bit of details on the type of ship that we're talking about and where the damage was, etc. All right, so now we're going to talk about 2 essential sets of terrorist organizational tools. So during the 1930s, the body of knowledge known as the administrative theory came about or emerged. And theorists and practitioners sought to identify some universal methods of administration that could be applied in all types of organizational settings. And in 1937, Luther Gulick coined the most enduring acronym of the functions of administrative aspects or administration, and he called it PostCorb. And I know it's a lot. So it's planning, organizing, staffing, directing, coordinating, reporting, and budgeting. PostCorb. So, and if you look in your textbook on page 156, you can read a little bit more about that. So, along with that, Cragen and Daly then basically reframed these administrative, the planning, organizing, staffing, directing, coordinating, reporting, and budgeting, reframed those into particular needs by terrorist organizations. And out of this, there were 2 sets of organizational tools that were developed, 4 of which were actually organizational and 6 that were operational. So, and I'll show you a chart in just a moment on what that looks like. Well, here we are. So here's kind of what it looks like. So again, this is data from Cragen and also Daly, and they put these together, and they basically took these terrorist organizational tools, and these 4, ideology, leadership, recruiting, publicity, these are organizational tools. And then these 6 are operational tools. And that would be command and control, weapons, operational space, training, intel and counterintelligence, and finance. And we're going to kind of walk through these individually. We're not going to spend too much time, but we'll at least brush over them so you have a better understanding of what we're talking about. So hopefully that makes sense. Okay, so again, broadly, the organizational tools, the 4, these are, must accomplish, are things that an organization must accomplish in order to foster its viability. So I'll list them, and then we'll kind of go through them individually. So you have ideology, again, leadership, recruiting, and publicity. So the first one, ideology, the reason for existing. Leadership kind of steers the organization. Recruiting acquires the followers. And publicity calls attention to what the terrorist group intends to do. So, again, ideology is the first one. So terrorism occurs when opportunity, motivation, and this ideology intersect. And ideology grows out of human rights abuses, economic equality, a sense of injustice, religion, and even political repression. So adopting a guiding and motivating ideology is the key decision because it plays the central role in communicating what that group is all about. It really must be powerful enough to motivate members to make sacrifices. And you'll kind of see what I mean here in a minute. Ultimately, it's at the heart of getting someone to basically pick up the gun. Now, ISIS or IS ideology inspires its followers to believe that the violent acts that they are committing fulfill the ordained will of Allah. And like radical Muslims, both, you even have the Ku Klux Klan and the neo-Nazis. They focus their hatred to some degree out of a warped interpretation of religion that becomes part of their core ideology. But again, there's going to be different factors that kind of play into this. And if you look at the photo on the right, you have Saeed Farouk and Tashfeen Malik. These are the 2 individuals that were responsible for the terrorist attack in the city of San Bernardino a couple of years ago. So, again, when you talk about different ideologies, skinheads, believe they are preserving the white way of life, and neo-Nazis admire the radical policies of Nazi Germany and hate within those, within Jewish communities. So again, it's all about the ideology. And I kind of gave this example already, talking about radical Muslims, and the Ku Klux Klan and neo-Nazis. They focus their hatred to some degree out of this warped interpretation of religion, etc., that then becomes part of their ideology. So again, ideology grows or develops out of human rights abuses, economic inequality, a sense of injustice, religion, and also political repression. Now, as we finish up the ideology portion, there may be a single factor that drives terrorist ideology, or there may be multiple factors. But regardless of the cause, there are typically three characteristics. The first being have a belief system that instructs people to do certain things. Number two, the belief system cannot be questioned or violated. And number three, the things to be done must be directed towards a goal. And so again, these are the three, factors, if you will, when we talk about driving terrorist ideology. And then just, kind of a final example, the Kurdistan Workers' Party, the PKK, has an ideology that is separatist and nationalist and also Marxist oriented. Their basic thing is seeking homeland for Kurds, and they're responsible for significant deaths of Turkish civilians, over 20,000 during the past 2 decades. So they have their own ideology as well. So that's the first of the 4 organizational tools, ideology. The second is leadership. So providing leadership is a crucial enterprise. Terrorist organizations are often embedded in, operate in, or travel through countries that are opposed to them. Even in so-called safe havens, terrorist leaders and facilities are vulnerable to different things like drone attacks or missiles, airstrikes, and even special operations. So it is important to have that leadership component built in. And, a little bit more on leadership. Subject to special efforts to capture or kill them. So a lot of these groups are, the leaders are subject to special efforts. There are lists maintained of leaders to be captured or killed. So this is the difficult part of being the leader, if you will. People with charismatic qualities draw people into terrorist movements. And then finally, simple chains of command make the leader more important. And now let's talk a little bit about recruiting. So recruiting identifies potential recruits and draws them into the organization, which fulfills 4 important needs for terrorist organizations. The first, to basically import new energy. Number 2, to acquire new sets of skills, because everyone's different and they might have different skills. To increase operational capabilities. And then finally, to replace losses caused by fighters being captured, quitting the cause, defections to other terrorist movements or organizations, or simply fatalities or casualties. Now, some recruitment efforts are aimed at recruiting people who don't really fit the profile of a terrorist. So, for example, Boko Haram is recruiting women who are basically pliable enough to be suicide bombers with babies cuddled in their arms. So when you kind of think about that, again, there is this, this recruiting challenge is to basically recruit people that kind of don't fit the normal profile of, let's say, a suicide bomber, right? And those that can also be indoctrinated to the degree that they're willing to face death. So they have to kind of be different, but they also have to be willing to die for the cause. And I have a couple of short videos, and I think I've shown you these links in a couple of other chapters we've covered. Look at the video on Justin Sullivan and then Michael DeFortry. They're both pretty good videos. And I talked a little bit about the Boko Haram. Okay, so staying with recruiting, a major challenge in recruiting new members, again, is identifying those who can be indoctrinated to the degree that they are willing to risk death or die to help achieve the goals of the terrorist organization. Roughly 3% of terrorist movements fail because they cannot replenish their ranks. Since 2002, women have carried out 50% of suicide bombings, making them, prized recruits. And an additional author, Olson, believes many jihadists get snared by terrorist organizations because they're vulnerable. More specifically, they're kind of in transition, or betweeners, as you might call them. The transitions may be moving from one high school to college, or just jilted or divorced, or lost a job and having difficulty finding another. Perhaps just finished graduate school and they don't know what their next move is going to be, or some other passage from one circumstance to another. And this is kind of, they seek out these type of individuals in order to pull them in. And I have a couple of photographs here where you can see, we talk about suicide bombings, which there's an explosive device in this woman's purse. So just, a little bit of, different ideas. So this process itself, it kind of varies. And it's tailored to different geographic different areas and have their own political, religious, and social history. So there's no single uniform recruiting process used to bring recruits into a terrorist organization. The process, again, it varies, and it's tailored to different geographic regions, that have their own political, religious, and social histories, to the recruiting pool, and finally, the individual. So it's kind of like a sales pitch, if you will. So here's kind of an example of a pitch to young men and women, and you'll see that it differs a little bit. And a pitch is basically how they're going to sell this. So a pitch to young men and women, again, is going to differ according to the following circumstances. One, if potential recruits are from a privileged class, the pitch might be patriotic or religious duty. If it's from a lower class, it might be seen as an advancement on social class. And if the parents actually disapprove or oppose, it might be thought of as an opportunity to, for that individual to gain some independence through self-discovery, kind of like, I'm going to go off and join this group to really find out who I am. And hopefully that kind of makes sense a little bit. So that's the pitch, but there's going to be different angles depending, upon where these individuals are, where they're at in their life, where they might live, etc. So again, we know the process varies, and it's tailored to different geographic regions, and it can also take place anywhere. So, it can take place, in a prison, a mosque, a coffee shop, or within any type of organization. So, recruiting may take place at a soccer game or on the internet, and other places where people come together. Originally Hamas recruited from refugee camps, but it now takes kind of a longer view. It spends perhaps as much as 60% of its annual budget on orphanages and sports clubs and health clinics and other social institutions, which has a kind of a double effect. It creates loyalty toward Hamas, as well as develops, deep pools from which to recruit. So you can see there's kind of, different recruiting pools out there. And they also even use cartoons, and we'll get an example of that in a minute. So as I said, Hamas spends the majority of their budget, on orphanages, sports clubs, health clinics, etc. But they also use cartoons to indoctrinate young people. And the individual or the picture that you're looking at right there is Farfour. So it's capital F-A-R, capital F-O-U-R, the mouse. And this mouse bears a remarkable resemblance to Disney's Mickey Mouse, but it really isn't that funny because they're using this to teach children the importance of Islamic domination and hatred towards Israel. So, it's kind of scary, but these are the tactics, the different recruiting tactics that they use. And it really doesn't stop there. The recruiting process can also be thought of as a funnel through which potential recruits kind of pass. But we've got internet recruiting, and here there are no geographical boundaries, right? So, it can be very global. So when you talk about technology, look, there's an author, according to Wyman, who identified some 5,000 terrorist websites. Terrorist organizations are technologically sophisticated, using social media sites to recruit, including YouTube, Twitter, Facebook, MySpace, chat rooms, and other sites. And the global, Islamic media front actually released an encryption program on the internet in 7 languages to provide secure communication for, popular messaging networks, including, AOL, Google Talk, and even Yahoo Messenger. So you've got all these different, tools that are out there. So I want to finish up with a couple things on recruiting, and then we'll move to the next one. So as I kind of talked about before, the recruiting process can be thought of as a funnel through which potential recruits kind of pass through. And I'll show you what the funnel looks like. And if you look on page 161 in your textbook, there's actually a diagram of the recruiting pool, because not everybody makes it through. All right. So when we talk about recruitment, we also have to kind of mention retention, right? Because they go together. So retention efforts are needed because there is some turnover that's going to exist, right? It's going to happen. So the key advantage, here is making sure that they don't have that type of turnover. So let's look at some different reasons, as it relates to turnover. So the first would be perhaps disillusionment with the strategies and tactics. So these are reasons for why turnover might exist. Number 2, a lack of respect for the leadership. And it's really funny, right? If you compare this to a business and you think about it, you ever had a bad boss? Okay, so even disillusionment, right? So the strategy, you don't like the way the department's going or this business is going. Number 2, the lack of respect for your boss. So you can cross these over. Number 3, resentment from taking orders from leaders who have never served on the battlefield, particularly when unnecessary casualties are seem to be caused by this leader's inexperience. And so again, this is very interesting. Number 4, a perceived inequality of compensation as compared to the members' contributions. Meaning, I'm not getting paid enough, right? And that kind of makes sense. 5, favoritism by leaders. 6, pleased to have the movement from families and friends outside of it with whom the member has maintained contacts. And then finally, the last one, switching from one group to another because they can be paid better. their families will be better fed, or for other pragmatic reasons. Now, again, when you look at this, are these totally business related? They really can be. So these terrorist groups, when we talk about recruitment and retention, it's really no different. And then I talked about that recruiting funnel. So here's an example of what that looks like. And keep in mind, here's your recruiting pool. And you have a large group that's going to come in, and they're going to get into this process. And you're going to have some that are going to, kind of resist the process, and some that are going to respond. And out of those, the ones that respond, these are going to go away. You're going to have just a few, and then only a few are going to be successful, and then only this many are going to actually finish their training. So that's kind of what they call the recruiting funnel as it relates to terrorism. All right, so now we're going to take a look at publicity. So remember, we're on our fourth out of four, the organizational tools. We talked about the terrorist organizational tools. We have the 4 organizational tools and then the 6 operational. Well, here is number 4 on the organizational tool side. So in a half dozen languages, terrorist movements achieve a substantial amount of publicity by using the internet, the cheapest and fastest means available for a lot of things. First, for fostering public awareness, for distributing propaganda, for shaping favorable opinion, for inciting violence, for influencing groups, for radicalizing visitors that come to the site, for raising funds, for example, by potential or actual supporters making donations or buying publications, etc. Number 8, providing training material, or simply training. 9, executing cyber attacks. 10, communicating other types of, or communicating with objectives. 11, the visual dead drop. 12, spread misinformation. And then finally, 13, spread misinformation. Then 14, demoralize opposing forces. So you have these 14 actually is what it adds up to. This is how they gain some publicity over the internet. So, as I said a moment ago, it's the fastest and the cheapest way. It's able to reach out to current and potential supporters. And it also shapes favorable international public opinion. So, kind of interesting when you, if you were to do some research, on the internet, Al-Qaeda distributed a 51-page step-by-step manual called The Art of Recruiting Mujahideen. And at each step, instructions are provided and points allowed for how successful the recruiter is in performing them. Now, if in a particular chapter, the recruiter doesn't get enough points, all steps need to be basically repeated until they do reach that level. And Al-Qaeda also publishes an online magazine to communicate its propaganda around the globe. So, publicity can also be used to demoralize, the enemy, by threatening their operations or demoralizing their operations. It can be used to, provide training and to walk people through these different types of recruiting processes. Because really the internet has very little regulation and censorship. And it does provide, as we talked about, this global coverage. Huge audiences can be reached. It's super inexpensive to develop and maintain a website. And there is also anonymity for the communicator. It also provides a kind of a multimedia platform, meaning you can watch videos and different things. And then finally, it can provide information about their organization. And the terrorist movements, to some degree, are going to influence how the regular news media might actually treat them. So this internet is a great tool for them. Okay, so that's kind of the publicity side, if you will. All right, so now we want to turn our attention to the 6 operational tools. So we've completed the 4 organizational ones, and now we're going to look at the 6 operational tools. So terrorist movements need operational tools in order to, carry out their missions, right? Generate their attacks. And remember that we've kind of modified Cragen and Daly's list of operational tools by combining a few categories together. But here are the 6 operational tools. So the first is command and control, or that type of a system. So a command and control system is a necessary condition and mechanism by which terrorist movements plan, staff, train, coordinate, and execute their attacks. They're also known as, C or, C2. And the stage of development and the size of a terrorist organization is really going to influence how this particular function is going to be executed. And meaning, again, when we're talking about, executing an attack, size here, of your terrorist organization is going to influence how this attack might be executed. And then here's the second operational tool, acquiring weapons. So acquiring weapons and a reliable source of spare parts, replacements of combat losses, and resupply of ammunition are essential. Supplied by individuals, state sponsors, or other terrorist groups, or purchased through drug money off the black market, or these types of weapons or even spare parts are basically acquired through individuals that are captured, or weapons caches that are actually taken over or captured. The arms inventory of a terrorist organization is a crude indicator of their size, intentions, and capabilities. So basically, you're going to be able to tell how broad this organization is, or what it's capable of, based on the type of weapons and the amount of weapons that they have. And that makes sense. Number 3 would be operational space. So having an operational space means a physical sanctuary or a safe haven where attacks can be safely planned, trained for, and rehearsed. Now, safe havens are places or situations that allow illicit actors, meaning people, individuals, including criminals, smugglers, and terrorists, to operate with impunity, which means that they can kind of just, do what they want to do, if you will. And other advantages include, that the terrorist can organize, plan, raise funds, communicate, recruit, train, and operate with a reasonable or high degree of security. So one way of thinking about operational space is the types of settings that are used as safe haven. And Lamb identifies 4 different settings for safe havens. And I'm not sure if I have them here. Okay, so I do. So the first would be, a land safe haven, meaning remote, kind of rugged terrain. And this is kind of the classic land safe haven. It's a region that is out of the way, possesses rugged terrain, and has a kind of a low population density with little or no government presence or interference, and even a dense vegetation cover. Although even, even some desert territory might provide cover. The second would be an urban safe haven. And this would include both traditional urbanized areas and non-traditional, suburbs, such as squatter villages or little shanty towns, if you will. Next, we would have maritime safe havens. And these are areas that are situated on lands that border, shallow waters, such as the 7,100 islands in the Philippines, as well as along the rivers that flow to the ocean. And these types of safe havens allow terrorists to move equipment and personnel from one country, to another rapidly on the vastness of the waterways, the oceans, to take advantage of that, the poorly monitored coastlines. So a lot of times that's a great way to move, weapons, etc., from one place to another. And then the fourth setting, if you will, is going to be a virtual safe haven, and we're talking about cyberspace. So these virtual safe havens exist in cyberspace and are used as a strategy to avoid being detected by security forces. And as we kind of talked about, in the previous chapter, virtual terrorist safe havens are presently cell-sized, and they're not complete organizations. So it's part of a big cell, and it has its own job to do, if you will. So hopefully that kind of makes sense. And I just kind of give you a little different map. I had one here when we talk about where terrorist groups might operate. In the modern terrorism period, the Bekaa Valley has the longest continuous history as an operational space for terrorist groups. So, and you can look right here because it's right off of a couple of rivers. So you can see this. So you've got the wooded areas here. You have the mountains. So these are mountains in here. All right. And then you have some hills, mountains, and then you've got the river, and you're still pretty close. And even there, you can get all the way from the river here. So you can see this is actually a pretty good place. And then just to kind of give you some other examples here. Okay, so still on operational tools. Now we're going to look at the fourth operational tool, and we're going to talk about training. So for most recruits to terrorist groups, training begins with an individual emphasis on indoctrination, physical conditioning, small arms familiarization, marksmanship, and the basic martial arts and self-defense. And more advanced topics include planting bombs and tactics for, let's say, assaulting military convoys and installations. And some terrorists will receive training for specialized functions like becoming a sniper or bomb building or car hijacking, hostage taking, and even taking out sentry posts. So we have all of these different, type things that are there. And, when we talk about, the war on safe havens, seems to have kind of, a little bit spelled the end to these large training camps, such as the ones that Al-Qaeda had in Afghanistan that were under the Taliban back pre-9/11. And the concurrent shift in Al-Qaeda's strategy to smaller independent cells and regional attacks has resulted in substantial terrorist e-learning courses becoming available on the internet on a variety of subjects, including things like bomb making manuals by one of Al-Qaeda's weapons masters. So again, we even have online kind of learning and training. So this stuff is starting to trend now. So, training is kind of a big thing, but now we're looking at even e-learning. So the fifth operational tool now is going to be intelligence and counterintelligence. So from a terrorist organization's view, intelligence is the collection, processing, integration, analysis, evaluation, and interpretation of available information on a particular subject. For example, the current intentions of America against, the Islamic State. Intelligence must be delivered with conclusions that are useful to the terrorist, the client, whoever that is, that's in need of it. The mere collection of data without any processing does not constitute intelligence. In contrast, a terrorist counterintelligence activities are a kind of a security tool consisting, of activities dedicated to undermining the effectiveness of the intelligence activities of America and its allies. So, just understand that, the mere just having data without going through what we've talked about, that processing, is not intelligence because it's not useful. So that should make sense. So again, from a terrorist view, you're going to need your information to be, analyzed, evaluated, and then interpreted. And then it needs to be delivered with some useful conclusions in order for it to be viable. And we talked a little bit about counterintelligence. And I put a little video on counterintelligence as it relates to the CIA in there if you want to take a peek at that. And then the sixth operational tool is finance. So with few exceptions, such as, financially secure lone wolf, terrorist, finance is of continuing concern to terrorist leaders regardless of whether they are just small cells or large transnational movements that are somewhat used to international business conglomerates. So finance, is of a continuing concern to any terrorist leader. After 9/11, new banking regulations were put into place, and the U.S. Department of Treasury's terrorist finance tracking program was actually established in order to assist tracking terrorist financing programs. And financial intelligence is really a formidable weapon, because if you can get a hold of their finances and you can freeze their finances, or even better, remove the finances, then they're not going to be able to run their system. And that's almost like any other business, right? You need some finances in order to run your business. So the annual income of the 9 wealthiest terrorist organizations range from IS at 2.5 billion to Al Qaeda in the middle with 150 million to the real IRA's 50 million. So you can see that they all have the need for money in order to finance what they're doing, to buy weapons, to kind of manipulate individuals perhaps to join their group, etc. And I threw in a chart that shows the 9 wealthiest terrorist organization, along with their sources of income. Because none of this is going to be legal. So hopefully you understand that. So here you have, when you look at IS, you have, exploiting natural resources, which is oil, gas, agriculture, extortion, Hamas, same thing, Hezbollah, drug trafficking, the Taliban, opium, heroin, drug trafficking. So all of these are different sources of income. So here's, a couple of the more wealthiest organizations. And then to kind of stick with finance for a minute, and you've learned this in a previous chapter, but the term hawala. And hawala is an Asian-based alternative readmittance system, meaning money system, that is based on trust and allows users to remain unknown and escape contact with banking and other officials. Now, it's illegal in some countries, and the dealers are often bound together by by a family or a business. But typically, no money is actually transferred. The transfers between dealers with very little paperwork, so there's really no way to traffic. It's kind of on a trust basis, if you will, and it's 24 hours, 7 days a week, and there's no taxes. But again, it's very, very difficult to track because there really is no paperwork. It's all built on trust. And I put this chart in here, and I think I had it in chapter 5 as well. But this talks about, kind of an example of what Hawala is and how it actually works. So if you want to take the time to take a peek at that, you can go ahead and do that. And here's kind of a crude example. It's in your textbook, I believe, on page 170. But it talks about, here's your transaction fee, and this is kind of how it goes. So this is kind of an example of a schematic or a kind of a hypothetical Hawala transaction, if you will. And then again, terrorism sources of revenue, just to kind of show you what a lot of these groups are into and how they actually get some of their revenue. So you can just kind of take a look at that if you want. And then talk a little bit for a minute about just a couple other ways that they make money, and we'll be done. We'll talk about Bitcoin. So this is an alternative remittance system that appears online, and back in 2009 is when it started, and it can be bought, transferred to someone else, and sold online. And if sold, your check is sent to your bank account, and some online merchants today accept Bitcoin. So kind of an interesting thing. But there are some European reports that terrorist movements are not using Bitcoin, in this country. Experts have dismissed claims that they are, calling them a little over-exaggerated. However, terrorist experts in Indonesia and some other countries maintain that terrorists are using Bitcoin. And and this is a subject that really bears some watching. Still Bitcoin has become kind of, for some, the currency of choice for some transactions. So, just kind of interesting. So an example would be in 2017, Los Angeles Valley College, get this, paid a ransomware request fee of $28,000 in Bitcoin to some hackers who said that if they didn't pay in a week, they would destroy all of the college's data. And then conversely, terrorists are also using PayPal as a means of accepting different types of donations. So, that's just a little bit of information on Bitcoin. And then you have narco-terrorism. And this refers to the use of terrorist attacks to support drug operations that are going to basically finance terrorism. And the decline of individual sponsorship has also led terrorist groups to supplement their income with the drug trade. And the illegal global drug trade may amount to as much as about $105 trillion annually. The United States estimates that about $2.3 billion from the drug trade ends up with different terrorist organizations. And different types of narco-terrorism, just to kind of throw that out there to you, would be things like beheadings, bombings, or even assassination. So this is violence that is kind of linked to narco-terrorism. And then I threw in a little chart again that talks about, this is a sample, if you will, of kidnapping incidents, captivity and ransom costs with some different countries. So you see the countries on the left, the kidnaps, per month, the days in captivity, and about the average ransom that's being paid on the right-hand column. And then just to kind of show you one thing, counterfeiting is becoming a little bit more, you're seeing a little bit more in this type of, revenue-based organization, if you will. And take a look at these. So I scan them in. One is an actual $20 bill, and one is in fact a counterfeit. And what I want you to do, and I know it's going to be hard, is for you to tell me which one is the counterfeit. So we'll call number one will be the one on top, and you can send me a message on this or whatever. And then number two will be the one on the bottom. And then finally, talking just a little bit about maritime piracy. This actually happens, and it does. It's something that happens where they're out there, robbing boats and ships, etc., for money and jewelry and things that can be sold. So I'm going to end with something called convergence. So there is a significant danger to terrorist organizations becoming too involved in the for-profit crimes. They may lose their ideological zeal because of the substantial profits to be made. And when this happens, they convert from one type of an organization to another. So the Philippines-based and ultraviolet, violent Abu Sayyaf group, it's the ASG, illustrates this point. Nominally, ASG wants to establish an Islamic State. However, it has become so involved in the for-profit criminal activities that its ideological foundation appears to be temporarily kind of eroded or even eradicated. Simply stated, ASG is a movement that is at that slippery convergence of terrorism and for-profit crime. A position that's, actually starting to show up with some different terrorist organizations because they're trying to make money to run their group. And if they can't make money, they can't run their group. But if they start to make money and they see how much money can be made, then sometimes they're going to move out of one path, if you will, and into another. Okay, so we made that in one lecture. That's great. Just a little over 60 minutes, so not too bad. If you have any questions, please feel free to email me. Otherwise, this will conclude our Chapter 6 lecture on the critical processes of terrorist organizations.